I'd like to
Hi,
welcome
you too.
everybody to the Wilson Center to this conference on the impact of Iran's presidential election on domestic issues and foreign policy. I have to say to you, I mean, when we were planning this with my colleagues, Kendra Heidemann and Julia Romano, we decided on this date and we kind of were wondering if there was a runoff, what it would have meant to have a meeting just when there was no conclusive results to the Iranian elections, but we decided to kind of take a bet, and looks like we won, and as did Rouhani. So this event comes nicely after the election results. Hale is going to moderate. Esfandiari will moderate the first panel, and I will do the second. I also would like to thank the Open Society and specifically Farnoosh Shamian, I don't see her here, for supporting us and for supporting this project on Iran that Hale Esfandiari had started when she was the director of the Middle East program. So without much ado, Hale,
thank you.
This is yours.
Good morning, and thank you, Henri. The Iranian voters, once again, I believe, showed on May 19 their political maturity by deciding to vote for a person whom they knew, the incumbent Hassan Rouhani, and with a lot of hope and I believe expectation from Mr. Rouhani that whatever he did not deliver during his first term, he would be able to deliver during his second term. A friend of mine from Tehran, when I asked her how she feels about these elections, she said, well, we voted for Macron and not Le Pen. And I said, Macron? She said, yes, that was it. And I said, are you sure the people in Kashan decided, for example, nothing against the Kashan. Let me say in Kerman, because I come from Kerman. The people in Kerman decided Rouhani is their Macron and Raisi Le Pen. She said, you don't get it. I said, okay. Anyway, we have a fantastic panel this morning with us. They will cover all the domestic issues related to Iran, and the second panel will be on foreign policy. I'm not going to spend time with their bios. You have them, and just introduce them. We'll start with Alireza Nader, who is a senior international policy analyst at the RAND Corporation, and he's the author of Iranian Domestic Challenges to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, followed by Elie Geranmayeh, who I believe is speaking the first time at the Wilson Center. Am I right? Yes. She's a senior policy fellow at the Middle East and North Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And then to my right, Ali Vaez, who is the International Crisis Group Senior Iran Analyst, and he has spoken a number of times here. So has Alex Vatankha. I think you spoke once or twice here. He's a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. All of them are good friends. Alireza, let's start with you.
All right.
12 minutes, please.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I hope you're doing well. I'll keep it pretty short. I just want to make a few comments about the presidential election itself and why I think it's important. Often when Iran has elections, people in Washington, or some people in Washington, say that the elections in Iran don't matter, they're fake, they're for show. And while Iran's elections and electoral system is very imperfect, it's not a democratic system. There's a Guardian Council that vets candidates. I do think that elections ultimately have an important impact on both domestic and foreign policy in Iran. And I think this was a particularly important election given where we are in terms of US-Iran relations, but really how Iran is evolving. I was personally afraid that turnout would be low and Iranians would be very apathetic toward voting, but turnout actually was very high at 70%. Even though Iranians know it's not a democratic system, a lot of them turn out unvoted. And I think there are a few reasons for that. One, I think people were just afraid. Rouhani's major opponent, Ebrahim Raisi, is a very conservative figure. He's associated with the security forces. He is responsible for the mass execution of political prisoners in 1988. He is rumored to be the favorite of Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, and the Revolutionary Guards. And in some aspects, he pursued a somewhat populist campaign, much like President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And most Iranians, especially those who voted for Rouhani, did not want a repeat of the Ahmadinejad years and a return to severe repression and tension with the outside world. So I think fear played a factor, but I also think that Rouhani does present a different vision than his rivals within the political system. Of course, Rouhani is part of the system. He has worked for Ayatollah Khamenei for a very long time. He's held very important positions in Iran's national security establishment. So he is part of the system. He wants to protect the system, but he also worries that the Islamic Republic is in danger, that it faces a lot of pressure, that Iranians are largely unhappy, that they feel stifled, lack economic opportunities, and live in a repressive system. And ultimately, Rouhani believes that for Iran or for the Islamic Republic to survive, it has to make some significant changes. I don't think this necessarily makes him a reformist. He's often associated with the more pragmatist camp. His mentor, Ayatollah Rafsanjani, who just passed away, really represented that sort of a thinking in terms of opening up the economy and pursuing a less ideological foreign policy. But I think Rouhani does have a very different vision for Iran than figures like Ayatollah Khamenei and Ebrahim Raisi, who he defeated. And while Rouhani has been careful not to associate himself too closely to the reformist camp, which has been largely sidelined from politics after the 2009 Green Movement protests, he is, I think, a key link to the reformists. And that's one of the reasons he won, actually, because the reformists, particularly former President Mohammad Khatami, encouraged people to go vote for Rouhani, and that played an important role in Rouhani being elected. So he's been very careful not to depict himself as a reformist, but to use his connections with the reformists to get ahead in Iran and win a second term. And when you look at actually how the reformists did in the elections, they did relatively well in the local elections, which I think are pretty important. For example, the city council in Tehran had been dominated by principalists for nearly 12 years, I believe. And I think they're all gone now, and Tehran will have a new mayor. So the reformists may have not won very big on a national basis, but they've done very well on in the local elections. And Rouhani has also some key allies in parliament as well. So politically, I think he's on the ascent, despite all the challenges that met his campaign, because the economy is still doing very poorly. Unemployment is a huge issue in Iran. Unemployment actually appears to have increased during Rouhani's presidency, and Iran is still largely isolated from the global financial system. And these really present major challenges to what he wants to accomplish, but he was elected. It'll be interesting to see how he will use his mandate. I think he has been very cautious when it comes to domestic issues. Yes, he delivered on the nuclear issue, but otherwise he hasn't really done much domestically because the forces of repression are still very powerful in Iran. The judiciary, the Revolutionary Guards, the Basij, the Ministry of Intelligence are largely out of Rouhani's control and influence, and they can really block a lot of his initiatives, as can the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei. So the key question is if Rouhani will pursue a bolder domestic agenda. In terms of foreign policy, I don't think he can change Iran's foreign policy that much, given the fact that Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guards are driving Iran's activities in the region, in places like Iraq and Syria and elsewhere. What I fear is that even the small opening that existed for dialogue and détente between the United States and Iran is going to disappear. We saw President Trump give his speech in Saudi Arabia. There's a lot of eagerness in Washington to put a lot of pressure on Iran and side with the Sunni Arab world, especially Saudi Arabia against Iran. So I think US-Iran tensions are going to go up quite a bit in the future, and Rouhani will not be able to do very much about it. And I hope that the US government anyhow keeps open dialogue with Iran and keeps engagement, because a shooting war in the Persian Gulf and elsewhere can be really disastrous for both countries and US national interests. Finally, I just want to talk about why Rouhani's election matters, probably more than anything else. And the reason why Rouhani being president matters right now is the fact that Ayatollah Khamenei is reported to be ill, he's aging, and the elite in Iran is considering the succession to him. And Ebrahim Raisi was considered or rumored to be a successor to Khamenei. He controls the Mashhad Holy Shrine, which is a very influential position, and it looked like he was being groomed to succeed Khamenei. Some analysts have argued that with Raisi's loss in the presidential election, he's out as a supreme leader, and now I think Rouhani has a better chance to shape succession to him, because essentially he'll be really the first most powerful person in Iran once Khamenei dies, for a brief period anyhow. And so as president, he has an opportunity to move into the position. Khamenei himself was Iran's president before he became the supreme leader. I don't think the very conservative forces in Iran would like that, and they would fight it. And I expect possibly a very rocky transition after Khamenei, especially if the system does not reach a consensus in terms of who should follow Khamenei and what path Iran should take in the future. Because although Iran has been relatively stable since 2009, I think there are major differences and divisions, both within the political system and in society as well, because a lot of people voted for Raisi, and there's a core conservative base that really believes in the principles of the Islamic Republic and the revolution and doesn't want Iran to change very much. So I fear that the forces within Iran, the political forces, may be headed toward a future showdown. Thank you.
Thank you, Alireza. Eli?
Thank you, Hala. Good morning, and thank you very much to the organizers for the kind invitation to join you from London. I'll maybe start off by just adding one comment about the election results. And I come from Europe, where the perspective on Iran is more nuanced and different to some of the debates in Washington. And for European governments that have really had diplomatic relations with Iran over the last 4 decades of the Islamic Republic, there is a clear difference when they're dealing with a presidency of, for example, Mr. Rafsanjani versus Mr. Ahmadinejad or Khatami and now Rouhani. So there is a clear appreciation for the difference that the role of the president inside Iran can make, while having an understanding that he is just one of many decision shapers within that system. And I think related to this issue is a sense now that after Rouhani's re-election, there is a degree of consensus being reached between the leadership of Iran and the people of Iran over a pathway of moderation and a non-isolationist policy, essentially. I think this question is going to feed into decisions about the succession of the Supreme Leader, and the fact that the overwhelming numbers in this election suggested that people want to follow this more moderate pathway. Now, I've been asked to look at the political aspects of Iran's economy under Rouhani's second term. Since I'm not an economist, I'm going to stay clear of stats as much as I can on this. But you know, the economy became the central focus of the campaigning for this election. And linked to this was two very competing visions for how Iran would serve its economic growth. And now, I've been of the opinion that the regime and the system inside Iran decided some time ago that the stability of Iran would be far more linked to actually economic power projection in the coming decades, rather than hard power security, although that plays a very critical element. But I do see this idea of becoming the economic powerhouses of the region being a long-term goal for the Islamic Republic. And this really fed into the discussions about what relationship Iran would have with the international community in order to serve these economic goals. Now, for Rouhani, there were a lot of challenges that came to light during this elections on the economic platform. While everyone could accept that his government, through careful management of the economy, really reduced inflation rates, which were a big problem for your average Iranian, there are still a number of issues remaining. First, you have a growing unemployment rate that actually grew, for the youth unemployment rate grew from 24% to roughly 30% under Rouhani's government. And these are mostly graduated, savvy, globalist thinkers that are coming out of universities without jobs. So tackling this issue was one of the main areas of debate in this campaign. Secondly, and related to that, was the growing social and income inequality inside the country. And one of the main conservative opponents really played on this with the idea of the 4% versus the 96%. And this grievance clearly is resonating with at least, you know, the 16 million people who voted for Raisi. Related to this issue is, you know, a third point of this issue of corruption and systemic, endemic corruption from top to bottom. And really being able to tackle this issue is going to be critical for Rouhani if he wants to reconnect Iran to international investment. Fourth, which feeds into issues to do with the nuclear deal, is reconnecting Iran's banking and financial infrastructure. Now, I've seen numbers above 200 banks, international banks, that have a correspondence relationship with Iran, but this falls very, very short of what it was pre-sanctions. And it's really made it very, very difficult to near impossible for Rouhani to deliver on the promises he made regarding what could bear fruit from the nuclear deal. Fifth, related to this issue of banking and sanctions, is the chilling impact that remaining US primary sanctions have had on the appetite of international companies, particularly those in Europe, to actually go back into the Iranian market, even where there is a legitimate area of business that can be conducted. And finally, related to this point is, you know, Rouhani really being able to manage the high expectations of a gold rush to Iran from the domestic perception. There has obviously been an uptick in investment and trade between Europe and Iran, and also Asia and Iran. But this has mostly been due to an uptick in oil exports over the last year. But this money hasn't really affected job growth and economic growth in the way that the government had been hoping, which was this, you know, target of 8% that looks like it's falling short of. And in the quick Q&A, I'm happy to go into where some of the money that's been coming from the oil has been spent over the last year. So the leadership inside Iran, I think, has really, really woken up to the fact that they're dealing now with a population that's, you know, 70% under the age of 45. This is the post-revolution generation, highly connected to social media, highly craving for change in the country in terms of both the economy but also the connection to the international community. So in terms of where Rouhani is going to, I think, focus a lot of his effort in the second term related to this issue of domestic economic policy, I've highlighted 7 areas. First, I think he's going to focus on strengthening non-oil sector industries, and this is going to be very critical for job creations inside Iran. As I mentioned, the post-sanctions growth inside Iran has been largely due to oil exports, and there's only so far that those oil exports are going to be feeding money into the country if the infrastructure isn't being developed. Secondly, it's to focus on the private sector growth. That's been one of the focus of his cabinet so far, has been to promote the private sector. He's going to face a lot of resistance to that from both the public sector, but also the IRGC, that is quite resistant to this policy. Third, and I think to also appease the wishes of the Supreme Leader, he will focus on domestic production and self-reliant economy. And part of that is also not to put all the eggs in one basket of hoping for international investment to boom in the second term. So domestic production is going to be one area. Fourth, related to this idea of not putting all the eggs in the basket of European investment, is I think there will be an expansion of economic trade and investment with Asian consortiums, and to a certain extent, when it comes to defense and security, with Russia. But fifth, related to this, is going to be an accelerated focus on getting European investment, technology, and know-how into the country. There's going to be, I think, more of an outreach with the European Union, which has, in its responses to Rouhani's re-election, has been far more positive and open to engagement than the United States has been. And there will be room for Iran to actually exploit those differences that are emerging between the Europeans and the United States on economic and political engagement with Iran. The sixth area is desecuritization of the economy. I mean, this is an area that he actually came out quite vocally about during the campaigning. But I think he's going to have to very carefully balance this with the need to actually give the IRGC economic organs a share of the pie going forward. So he can't fully marginalize them, but he can start to agree on a list of sectors where the IRGC can have dominant control, and a list of sectors where the government can have control, in order to be able to attract foreign investment. And areas like energy, technology, infrastructure is going to be areas where the government wants to have more of a stake and control over. And seventh, and finally, is really resolving this issue of access to the banking and financial sectors globally. I mean, this actually came up in the debates a number of times about how Iran would actually reconnect. The opponents from the conservative camp seem to follow a policy of being much more firm and hostile and confrontational in their approach with the United States on this issue. Rouhani seems to dangle the prospect of further negotiations over this issue, which might include lifting or easing of other sanctions on Iran that are preventing the reconnection to banking and investment sectors. But again, I think that this is a ball that's now left in the court of Washington at the moment. And Rouhani's press briefing this week, right after the Riyadh summit, seemed to be adopting a policy of strategic patience with the Trump administration, and still saying that, if the people have given me the mandate, and also, another caveat, if the Supreme Leader accepts this idea, we will be looking at, further room for negotiations with the United States and the West. So I'll leave it at that, and I think that's a good place for Ali to pick up.
Thank you, Ali.
Thank you very much, Hale. It's a great pleasure to be back at the Wilson Center. I've been tasked to talk about the nuclear deal and sanctions, which I guess is probably the easiest subject, because with the architect of the nuclear deal remaining at the helm, I can wrap it up in one sentence and say there's going to be continuity rather than change. But of course, I have to make it much more complicated than that. So I'll talk about 3 different strategies for the next 4 years for the Iranian government to handle the nuclear and sanctions policies. Let me remind you that governance in Iran is a function of consensus building. The president can advance his agenda, but as long as his goals are in line with that of the leaders, and also he's able, through compromise and behind-the-scenes negotiations, bring on board a critical mass of other stakeholders in this multipolar political system. Pressure from grassroots can work, can lead to change, but only in cases that it generates a certain degree of consensus at the top. So with that in mind, strategy number one was to resolve the nuclear standoff and put the country on a stable footing at a time that the region is in turmoil and there might be a possible transition to the next supreme leader. I think despite differences over negotiating tactics, style, and tone, overall there was broad consensus around this strategy within the system. And that consensus still holds. This is why, in contrast to US electoral campaign, all the presidential candidates in Iran supported the nuclear deal. They pledged to remain committed to it. Nobody promised to tear it apart or renegotiate it. There were criticism of President Rouhani because his rivals believed that he was weak and he was seen as too compromising, and that was the reason that he hasn't been able, in their wars, to cash the check that Iran received under the nuclear deal. And they argued a stronger, more revolutionary government in Tehran can better stand up to the United States and basically reap the dividends of the nuclear deal. But regardless of this, everybody treated the deal as a done deal. And I should also note that the deal, despite the fact that it has not delivered on some of the promises, or at least not to the level of popular expectations, remains pretty popular in Iran, according to the polls. Strategy number two, around which there is also a high degree of consensus, is that if the deal falls apart or is undermined, Iran will have to win the international blame game. This comes out of the experience of the sanctions era. So if the lesson of Iran-Iraq war was that Iran should have its own self-reliant conventional deterrence capabilities, the experience of the sanctions era was never again should Iran be put in a corner, isolated, and seen internationally as the inflexible party at fault. And I think, again, around this there is a broad consensus. This is why the Supreme Leader said last year that Iran is not going to be the first to violate the nuclear deal. And President Rouhani 2 days ago in his press conference repeated this verbatim. Now, and this is where the result of the elections could have been consequential, because obviously with Rouhani and his team of smiling diplomats, with their experience in projecting a reasonable image of Iran to the outside world, you can better advance this policy. Obviously, you have a better chance of driving a wedge between the US and its P5+1 partners if the US starts undermining the nuclear deal unilaterally. A Raisi presidency would have made this much more complicated, especially from the perspective of the Europeans, and Eli can comment on that, but I think it would have made it much more difficult for European leaders to side with Iran, given Raisi's awful human rights record. But there's a wrinkle here. Talking to Iranian officials, my impression is that they are increasingly coming to the conclusion that the Trump administration is not going to kill the deal with a gunshot. And I think the extension of waivers that extended the suspension of US nuclear-related sanctions is evidence for that. But they believe that Washington is going to go after killing the deal with 1,000 cuts, or maybe even 100 cuts, in the form of new sanctions. And the dilemma in Tehran, around which there's a lot of debate, is how to respond. And here's the dilemma. If they retaliate by either nuclear measures or non-nuclear measures, they provide justification for their adversaries in this city to impose more sanctions or even resort to some kind of limited military action against them. If they don't respond, it could be seen as a sign of weakness and invite even more coercive pressure. As you know, tomorrow the Senate is going to pick up S-722, the bill that is called Countering Iran's Destabilizing Activities of 2017. Its draft has several provisions that are that could undermine the nuclear deal. At least one provision is a clear-cut violation of the nuclear agreement. If the bill becomes law without removing these problematic provisions, the Iranians will immediately face this dilemma. And this is the first time under the Trump administration that they're facing a congressional legislation that will be signed by the president. It's supported by both parties. And, and the way they respond would set a precedent and would determine the tone for the next months and years. Now, strategy number 3, and this is the last one I'll talk about today, is the one around which there is no consensus whatsoever. And that is what Eli mentioned, which is Rouhani's promise during the campaign to lift the non-nuclear sanctions. To be fair, he attached a lot of conditions to it. He said the people should ask for it and the leader should guide us in that direction. In his very typical wily manner, he actually put the ball in Ayatollah Khamenei's court. But obviously, removing the non-nuclear sanctions would require not just behavior change, but I would argue it requires fundamental change of the system's identity almost. It also requires a direct bilateral channel of communication between Iran and the United States. At this stage, I don't see any appetite in Washington or even in Tehran for engaging in this kind of negotiations and making the concessions that are necessary for making this kind of deal happen. So what are the chances of President Rouhani delivering on this promise? Historically, Iranian presidents are bolder in their second term because they get a stronger mandate, usually a higher percentage of votes. And they don't have another election to look forward to. That brings them in direct clash with the deep state in Iran, which resists change and tries to stymie them at every turn. And as a consequence, the Iranian presidents are often weaker in their second term. So by definition, Rouhani 2.0 is going to be a weaker president. However, I think he's the ultimate Ayatollah Machiavelli of the Islamic Republic. And he stands a better chance of not committing the same mistakes that his predecessors made and probably would be able to have a better record in his second term compared to other presidents. And in this, I think there is an opportunity. If the two sides agree on some kind of incremental progress, some kind of a better for better arrangement that would allow both sides to declare victory. Remember, the experience of the first year of implementation of the nuclear deal was that without some relief of U.S. Secondary financial sanctions or even primary U.S. sanctions, the embargo between Iran and the United States, Iran faces serious challenges in reaping the dividends of the nuclear deal. So the incentive on the U.S. side is clear. It's additional sanctions relief. And I would argue a Republican president backed by a Republican Congress has much more credibility to offer the Iranians incentive than Obama ever did. On the Iranian side, there's obviously a long list of measures that I think the U.S. would be interested in areas where there is more common ground, like Iraq or Afghanistan. Maybe it's easier to make some kind of progress. In areas like Yemen and Syria, it might be more difficult. But again, I think it's a mistake to rule out the possibility of making progress in the next 4 years. It depends a lot on the political will on both sides and the context in which the parties operate. But that would be the story of the next 4 years. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Alex?
Thank you, Holly. Good morning. It's great to be back at the Wilson Center, and thanks for the invitation. I was asked to talk about the role of the military in the security. And I have to say, I can only look at what happened on the May of 19th to use the analogy that the Iranian Supreme Leader Khamenei likes him so much, a huge slap in the face of the Revolutionary Guards. I think the fact that Rouhani got 23 million votes came down in the last few weeks to the fact that he was able to bring the voters out. And he did that by speaking in a certain way, and everyone knew what that language was about. He spoke about day in the 3 presidential televised debates. He was extremely bold. He really pushed the envelope in terms of saying, highlighting and criticizing some of the bad things that the IRGC does at home and in the region. His vice president, who was in the debates as insurance for Rouhani, he was the only one who publicly said, and this is wonderful thing about being an Iran watcher, sometimes you have to read between the lines. He kept saying, who were they who attacked the Saudi embassy? But everyone in Iran knew who they meant. And by and large, that means the Revolutionary Guards. So the fact that Rouhani, somebody who's never called himself a reformist, really doesn't have much of a reformist pedigree. Here's a man who in 1999 famously threatened the reformist students with hanging if they didn't go back to their dorms. So he's not a Mohammad Khatami. And in the last few days, perhaps weeks of the election, he had to sell himself as a Mohammad Khatami. And he could only do that, he could only mobilize, he could only get those millions of voters out by particularly targeting the Revolutionary Guards and the bad things they do at home and in the region. And that resonated. And I think the sort of scenes of partying that you see in Tehran and elsewhere really shows you that certainly the younger generation, you heard some statistics before, do believe that the Revolutionary Guards are at the heart of so much that is going wrong in the system. And if you believe that Raisi was the candidate of the Revolutionary Guards, which I think is a safe assumption to make, then they lost. They lost big. And the question is, will they take that as a lesson? Would they tone it down? Or are they going to go on the offensive? Because if you look at Iranian media today, there are those people who are saying the IRGC Revolutionary Guards generals just can't wait to punish Rouhani, just can't wait to come back and seek revenge. If that's the lesson the IRGC has learned, then we're set for a rocky few months and years to come. You can expect more arrests of dual nationals, like our friends Siamak and his father Bagher Namazi, who are just being picked up, and many other cases like that. We can see more political prisoners. That would be IRGC seeking revenge. And again, we talk about the Iranian military. We have to remember the Iranian military is divided into two. The regular armed forces, the Artesh, about 350,000. They're not political animals. They stay out. Their role is to defend the country. They have a very legitimate role to play. IRGC isn't just a military force. It's the protector of the system, but the trouble is it sees the system only when it delivers for its narrow interest. It's IRGC's political and economic interest, not necessarily the national interest of Iran. And I think what you saw on the May of 19th was a reaction to that. People saying enough, you have enough, you imprison, you threaten, you engage in adventurism in places like Syria and Iraq. We saw people close to Rouhani being asked to show up in court because they criticized what Iran is doing in Syria. So again, if you want to, you could boil it down to a vote, a referendum. People often talk about the May of 19th being referendum about the nuclear issue. That was never really on the cards. Nobody in Iran was against the nuclear deal of 2015. If this election of May of 19th was a referendum, it was about the role of the IRGC. And I think it's very clear that the Iranian people spoke against the IRGC. They think IRGC is a danger to Iran's well-being. But the question is, what will the reformist movement do with the mandate they got? Let me tell you a story from something that happened to me yesterday. I was in a Voice of America Persian show, and the other guest who had called in from London was referring to the IRGC as our brothers and a national treasure. And I said, look, you speak of the IRGC as a national treasure, and yet in the campaign itself, on a televised debate live on Iranian TV, the president, the incumbent that you supported, said, when I'm trying to reach out to the world, there are folks who write bad, dangerous slogans on ballistic missiles and parade them downtown Tehran. Or they have camera crew down in these missile silos and are projecting a very negative, a dangerous face of us. And Rouhani's point was, who are these people? Again, that everyone knew, that's Revolutionary Guards. So I said to the guests from London, I said, look, you have to admit that the fact that you got 23 million votes out, the fact that Rouhani could do it, was because you, in the campaign in the last few days, spoke about the dangers of what IRGC is doing. Now, are you going to, in the next 4 years, implement some of these promises? Are you going to stand up to the IRGC? Because you have 23 million people who want you to stand up to the IRGC. Or are you going to be another lame duck president like Mohammad Khatami, who from 97 to 2005 really never got himself mobilized enough to stand up to the IRGC? That's the big challenge for the reformists. That's the big challenge for Rouhani. I agree with Ali. Rouhani is very smart. He's not going to do anything that's going to risk him become another Iranian president that has to flee like Bani Saad did in 1981. He's too smart for that. But if he cares about the future of this system they call the Islamic Republic, he needs to either confront the IRGC or seek to co-opt them. He tried to co-opt them in his first term. If you remember, if you go back to September of 2013, the first big speech he gave was in the front of the IRGC generals. And he said to them, look, just don't get involved in politics. Go back to your barracks. We'll give you enough money. We'll make sure you have projects that you can get engaged in. There will be enough money for you. Don't fear change. That was a very telling speech, which by the way, the following day, the Supreme Leader Khamenei backed that same sentiment up and said the same thing. And this takes me for a second to the role of Ayatollah Khamenei, the Supreme Leader. Ayatollah Khamenei is also looking to use Rouhani because he gave that speech in support of Rouhani's call for the IRGC to pull out from the realm of politics, or at least lessen their impact. But a year or two later, he came out and basically gave the IRGC a blank check. Once the nuclear deal had been signed, he no longer really needed Rouhani as much. And this sort of playing games the way Khamenei does, again, it only prevents real reform from happening in this country we call or this system we call the Islamic Republic. Let me tell you, the guest who were sitting in London and having this debate with me, he's a man by the name of Karoubi. He's the son of the second most prominent Iranian political opposition leader on the house arrest for 6 years. He's the son, Nataqi Karoubi, who's basically calling the IRGC national treasure. IRGC that is holding his father basically hostage. And this is the issue that reformists need to sort of get their heads around. If they genuinely want to implement reform, they have to openly admit, as they started doing with Rouhani's presidential campaign, they have to admit and they have to be persistent in standing up to the IRGC, in being able to question what the IRGC does, and they would be totally within their rights to do so. Even the Constitution of the Islamic Republic says IRGC should not get involved in politics. And yet everybody knew Raisi was their man, and that is why people voted against Raisi. When Raisi was turned into the head of the Imam Reza Shrine in Mashhad back in 2016, you all remember, of those of you who are Iran watchers, remember how the top leadership of the IRGC suddenly flocked over to Mashhad to meet Raisi, the likes of Qasem Soleimani, to say, to pay their respects. Iranian people who voted for Rouhani remember images of like that, and do not want a militaristic system. And that's one of the key messages from this election. They do not want to go down the path of a more powerful IRGC that sets the agenda and gets about executing an agenda that serves narrow interests of the IRGC, but not necessarily the Iranian people. And again, succession has been brought up. I'm running out of time, so I won't speak much more, but succession is key. And what is different about Rouhani's re-election this time around in 2017 is that you do have somebody who in July 16th of this year will turn 78. That's somebody Supreme Leader Khamenei. Rouhani has, if he wants to be bold, if he wants to continue to be bold, has the potential to see himself as the next Iranian Supreme Leader. Or he can back somebody like the grandson of the founder of the system, Khomeini, Hassan Rouhani, or even someone like Mohammad Khatami. We don't have to limit ourselves to Raisi or Ali Larijani, the head of the judiciary, or even someone like Mahmoud Shahrudi as the potential successors. The reformists need to be bold, because when they're bold, they have the people come out for them, and that is their strength. It's not because they're great technocrats necessarily, it's the people power that they can mobilize. And the question remains to be seen if they're going to tap into that. But I think right now it would be a good moment for them to start being ambitious. If they really want to change the trajectory of the Islamic Republic once Khamenei leaves the stage, they need to look at this election as a moment for them to not just look at it and say, okay, as Ali said, we're gonna be happy with whatever we get. They can be, I think, much more ambitious. Time will show if they will be. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. A question to the panel, just following up what Alex said. Is the Supreme Leader willing to go along with reining in the IRGC, or whether it is a dream that Mr. Rouhani has and is pushing? Because as we know, I mean, the commanders are appointed by the Supreme Leader. They report directly to him. They necessarily can easily bypass the president, although they report to the Supreme National Security Council. But can they? Let's start with Ali and then move to Ali and then Ali Reza and last.
Sure,
Okay.
thank you, Hala. The Supreme Leader is often termed as the supreme balancer of the different forces inside of the country. And I think that he will continue to see his role going forward as that balancing force within the system. And I think Rouhani also recognizes that any change within the power structure of Iran, given how powerful the IRGC managed to consolidate their power and how much power they do now have because of the sanctions years and because of the effect that Ahmadinejad's presidency had. This is not going to be a 4-year project. This is going to be a decades-long project to reduce the role of the IRGC. And I think that the Iranian people know what they want, but they are also understanding that this is going to be a gradual change and a process that is going to take some time, particularly if you factor in that, one of the issues that the IRGC has quite effectively, I think, managed to use is the insecurity in the region. So they often, on the social media sites point out, look, do you want to be another Iraq? Do you want to be another Afghanistan? Do you want to be a Pakistan? Compare yourself to the region and understand that it's the IRGC that is protecting the borders. And you often even get things like, well, if the voters of Tehran want to kick us out, well, maybe we stop protecting the city of Tehran. Small signals that the IRGC's Quds force abroad is actually taking certain measures that is effectively protecting Iran's border. And some of the messages that came out after the 19th of May election was, the political maturity of the voters is now they neither want change through sanctions nor do they want change through the bullet. And it's going to be a gradual process. So I do think that the Supreme Leader is understanding what is happening to the population change and the youth boom and the need that for the Islamic Republic to survive, it needs to respond to the needs of that generation. But I think he's also going to have to understand that the IRGC, despite his direct oversight over them, have a vast deep state structure that is going to need to be very carefully balanced.
Ali?
I'll make 2 points. Number one, I think the Supreme Leader, as the custodian of the system, wants to preserve the nature of the system. And at the end of the day, this is a constitutional theocracy. It took 14 centuries for the Shia clerics to ascend to power in Iran. And guess what? This is the first time and the last time. They know it. So losing power to the military is a one-way street. And that's why the Supreme Leader really dominates the IRGC. I've always disagreed with people in this city who even many years ago said that this had become a militarized state. The IRGC remains subordinate to the Supreme Leader. I've never seen a single incident that they have challenged the leader's authority. However, I think he also doesn't like them to be overstretched in the economy. You ask Shah's former generals, why did you miss the revolution? And the answer is because we were busy in the real estate. you know. So they still have to have their focus on where it matters. And that's why, as Alex mentioned, the Supreme Leader came out in support of Rouhani when he asked them, instead of being widespread in the economy, to focus on a few national projects. And I think on that front, the Supreme Leader could be supportive of Rouhani, again, as long as he chooses a prudent path that doesn't escalate tensions internally. One caveat that I would add to what Alex said, and I agree that the Iranian people mostly don't like the IRGC to be omnipotent in Iran in all fields of politics and economy, is that the majority of Iranian people, let's remember that Mr. Raisi got 16 million votes. Yeah. So, and that's where it really matters how the outside world treats Iran and how the outside world affects this balance of power. You know, if we continue ignoring that Iran has a certain degree of sophisticated domestic politics, and there are all these forces that are engaged in serious pull and push, we risk empowering those who actually we want to see reined in.
Alireza.
So I think that Khamenei wants somebody like him to succeed him, but he also knows that could be destabilizing for the Islamic Republic, because Khamenei very clearly understands a lot of people don't like him, that they don't like a lot of the Islamic Republic's characteristics. He saw that in 2009 when a lot of Iranians came into the streets in protest. He's acknowledged that there are people who oppose the system, but he's encouraged them to go vote in presidential elections that Rouhani ran for. And I think he does realize in some ways his regime is in trouble. And he's not completely blind to his regime's problems. I think when you look at the Middle East, to me anyhow, a lot of the leadership across the region either is very blind to potential forces of instability, or chooses to ignore them, or can't really do anything about them. But I think with Iran's system, there's a certain degree of flexibility, and Khamenei has shown that he's not completely ideological. He supported the nuclear agreement, perhaps half-heartedly, but he realized Iran needed an agreement with the outside world. And although he's not completely aligned with Rouhani, he has supported him in a lot of ways as well. I think he's willing to rein in the Revolutionary Guards because in some ways he realized his mistake in 2009 by promoting Ahmadinejad and the Guards. He helped shake the system to its core. So he realizes those dangers, and he has to balance his own desires and the interests of the Revolutionary Guards with more pragmatic elements in the political system and the public. I think it's just a very hard balancing act, because once he passes away, if the Revolutionary Guards try to dominate the succession, then you could have a lot of instability. But if the Revolutionary Guards don't dominate the succession, somebody like Rouhani could come into power, and while he wants to preserve the system, I think the conservatives, including Khamenei, believe that even small changes to the system could lead to very big changes and throw the whole system off and cause it to come apart. So he does rein in the Rev Guards when it suits him, and I think since 2009, they haven't been as overtly interventionist in Iranian politics, although they're still very powerful. I'm not sure if they would, once Khamenei dies, I think they would feel very threatened and try to be very aggressive.
Alex, just last point that Alireza made. If the Supreme Leader is reining in, or can rein in, or does rein in the IRGC, so then shouldn't he think that the next Supreme Leader should have the same relationship with IRGC? And wasn't that the idea behind pushing Raisi to run? Because basically he came out of nowhere, and suddenly he was the candidate, and maybe because, first of all, he's young, he's 57, 58. Secondly, he has good relations with the IRGC. Thirdly, the Supreme Leader trusts him. So is that going to be the criteria as far as the Supreme Leader is concerned for the next Supreme Leader?
You know, Hala, I don't know. I would be lying to you if I said I knew exactly what Khamenei thinks when he wakes up in the morning. But I've seen contradictory signs when it comes to his position on the question of Raisi's candidacy. I mean, somebody who's very close to Khamenei, who recently resigned from his office, Hujjat al-Islam Ali Akbar Natiq Nouri, resigned from the office of the Supreme Leader. He had a position, a senior position, resigned for one purpose, so he could actively, openly support the candidacy of Rouhani, the re-election of Rouhani. So here is Natiq Nouri, someone very close to Khamenei, who does that. That tells me either the Supreme Leader's office is playing both sides, or they really wanted Rouhani to win. Maybe the consensus is that Iran doesn't have a history of military dictatorship. This is not Turkey, this is not Pakistan, this is not Egypt. Maybe the clerics are thinking they can still be the masters of the system, not giving too much power to the IRGC generals, who frankly don't have. I mean, I take what Ali says about 16 million people voted for Raisi. That is true, but I don't think 16 million people voted for Qasem Soleimani. I doubt it. And when Qasem Soleimani, his pictures were being used by the Raisi campaign, he had to say, no, don't show my, don't use my photos, because it was a risky strategy. And I want to say one more thing, Ali, if I could, on the question of, because this is key. Khamenei in 1989 was 49 years old when he became Supreme Leader. He had no base of his own. Everyone knew he didn't have the religious qualifications. They actually had to change the constitution to allow him to become Supreme Leader. So he needed somebody, a base in society. For him, that was the IRGC. But he's been in place now for 27 years. And the next Supreme Leader, if there is going to be a next Supreme Leader, doesn't necessarily have to have the IRGC as a base of support. It could be someone who looks to the people, the masses, the 23 million, who I agree with my fellow panelists. Iranians, by and large, don't want shock therapy. They had one revolution in 1979 in the hope of getting democracy. Look what that got them, right? So they want gradualism. And if Rouhani is going to be the one who can take him gradually towards that destination of something that looks like a representative system, because today it's not. Today is a theocracy. It's not representative. Let's not kid ourselves. 6 candidates were allowed to run, and all 6 candidates would have been people that Khamenei could have tolerated. So these are not real, it's a democratic exercise, but extremely limited, and you have to question how valuable that is. So I want to say it goes back to the question of, what does Khamenei really want? Does he want to make his son the next Supreme Leader? In that case, he wants the IRGC to be powerful. But he wants to have a system that relies on the sort of legitimacy, or he drives its legitimacy from the people, then that he could take a whole different path. And that would be a path in which IRGC doesn't have to play the kind of role it's played since 99. And 99 is key. 99 was the first time the IRGC wrote a letter to a sitting president, Mohammad Khatami, said, do this or we'll remove you from power. Now, let's hope IRGC is not going to be writing letters like that again anytime soon.
Okay, we'll open the floor. Audrey?
Thank you for all your presentations. This may be rather naive questions, but it occurred to me that none of you mentioned anything about the minorities in Iran. So how did the Baluchis, how did the Kurds vote? Is there any sentiment against the regime in those parts? I mean, we know there's some movement both in Kurdistan and Baluchistan, but I'm trying to figure out what impact the minorities have on both the internal politics of Iran and all these issues that you mentioned.
I mean, very quickly, historically, if you look at the data, reformists do best in the peripheries. Kurdistan, Baluchistan, that's where the reformists do best. And I think that, if I'm not mistaken, The latest figures show again that they did really well. I know for the local elections, they overwhelmingly won across the board in Balochistan. And one thing I say about that, again, as part of this new energized President Rouhani in the last few weeks, one of the taboo issues he started touching upon, which was risky, but he got away with it, was he started talking about discrimination against the Sunnis on live TV. He said there are people that we want to appoint to senior positions, but because they're Sunnis, they wouldn't let us. So he was definitely courting the minority vote.
Anybody else?
I can maybe
or-
just add that in Kurdistan, for example, 70% voted for Rouhani. The Sunni leader of Iran, Maulana Abdul Hamid, endorsed Rouhani. So overwhelmingly, the minorities, both ethnic and sectarian, were supporting Rouhani. And it's quite interesting because Rouhani has a security background, so he realizes that you can't have your borders in provinces on your borders impoverished, and in a situation that some of your regional rivals are also trying to exploit the sentiment of discontent in these provinces to destabilize Iran. So he made, for example, in Kurdistan, in contrast very much to Turkish policy in dealing with its own courts, invested a lot in Kurdistan. The biggest petrochemical factory of Iran was opened in Kurdistan during Rouhani's first term. He allowed education in mother tongue in schools and universities in Kurdistan. So he has been making an effort, and I think the minorities realize that there is a sharp difference between him and Mr. Raisi, and therefore they supported him.
The cartographer, the French cartographer Bernard Urquhart, who was a public policy scholar at the Wilson Center, just came out with a map of how the Iranian voters voted, in this election. It's very interesting to look at how they did. I think he's going to circulate it very soon, and we'll put it on our website. Yes, please, in the back.
Rafiq from American University. So my question is about foreign policy toward Russia. Would we expect, should we expect any more alignment, more closer relations with Russia in Syria and Iraq? Do we expect any changes in those foreign policies during new term? Thank you.
Who wants to take it?
I'll take it.
Okay.
Yeah, I would expect closer cooperation, not just in Iraq and Syria, but elsewhere as well, in places like Yemen, perhaps, because I feel like the Russians and Iranians have formed a true strategic alliance. And it's based on opportunity, but right now their interests really converge in the Middle East. And I don't see the United States improving relations with Russia. I think that is a key. If the US does improve relations with Russia, then in theory, the Russians might weaken their support for Iran, but I don't see that happening right now anyhow. And there's no reason to suggest that really anything is going to disrupt the Russian-Iranian relationship. If anything, I would expect Russian bombers to go back to Iran and use that as a base. So I see an expansion rather than contraction of cooperation.
I'm sure the next panel, which deals with foreign policy, will pick up on this topic. David, please.
Dave Ottaway here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Could you explain to us how Raisi came out of nowhere, who backed him, who put him up to running, and what are we to make of that, his relative success?
Should I?
Eli,
I
you
can
want
let
to-
Alex take it.
Ali?
That's
Ali.
Alex, sorry, he's
Alex,
quite eager to
go
just
ahead.
go.
I mean, he is a foot soldier. He got his first job when he was 19 years old in a court as a clerk, but very quickly he was signing deaths. Well, we've rumors, we don't really know, I can't prove this, but certainly that is his reputation. So he comes from the city of Mashhad, which is also the hometown of Khamenei, so he knows Khamenei through those clerical circles. He's also Sayyid, a descendant of Prophet Muhammad. Again, these are relatively small circles. He also is the son-in-law of a very prominent figure in the system, Ayatollah Huda, who's the Friday prayer in Mashhad. So in other words, he is a product of the system, and he's risen because of his connections. I mean, he was picked up as a young man to be politicized by Mohammad Beheshti when he was around before he was assassinated in 1981. And since then, we haven't really heard much about Mr. Raisi except the tapes that surfaced last year where he was one of the 4 who was engaged in this decision to mass execute political prisoners. But obviously, he is someone that is trusted because the job he got, I think it was in March of last year, to be the custodian of the Imam Reza Shrine, which is the wealthiest, I believe, Muslim endowment anywhere in the world. You don't just get that job unless the Supreme Leader has faith in you. And he got that job, and that's when we all started saying, you know, speculation that he's handpicked. This is being, he's being groomed for the top job, and then he comes in and loses with the margin he lost. And that is where we're sort of scratching our heads and think, how can he possibly be the Supreme Leader when he was defeated so handsomely at the hands of the people?
Ali?
Just a two-finger on that. I think Rouhani, in addition to the fact that he went to his left to bring a lot of the undecided voters and maybe apathetic voters on his side, owes his victory to a large extent to Mr. Raisi and the mistakes that he committed during the campaign. First of all, I think uniting behind Mr. Raisi was a mistake in retrospect for the Conservatives, because it took them 20 years to coalesce around a single candidate. This was the biggest problem that they had in the elections. Now they coalesced behind a man who had very limited executive experience. He's always been he has spent a lifetime in the judiciary. He has very limited appeal. The man is just simply not charismatic, and that came out in the debates. And he has, again, an awful record when it gets to his involvement on the so-called death committee in the late 1980s that is responsible for executing a lot of leftist dissidents in Iran. And I would argue if Ghalibaf and Raisi actually had stayed in the race, probably we would have gone to the second round. And then the stakes would have been higher. So there were mistakes that the Conservatives did. Also, the Raisi camp, they decided in order to absorb Ahmadinejad's constituency to bring on board a few people, a few advisors, former ministers of Ahmadinejad. And that provided Rouhani with a very powerful tool of fear-mongering, basically, of reminding the Iranian people of the abject failures of the Ahmadinejad era. And the motto was actually, we're not going to go back in the past. And that really helped. But I also disagree a little bit with people who say Raisi is done as a result of this failure. Yeah. Yes, it was a setback for him. But again, a man who came out of nowhere 2 months ago was virtually unknown to the public, has now been able to secure 16 million votes. He's been able to raise his profile. And I don't think he's going to just simply fade away.
Yeah, David, an anecdote was that because he was aware of women's vote, and that was very important for him, suddenly out of nowhere, his wife, who is also working, gave an interview and said, I want you to know when I come late at night to the house, my husband is the one who cooks. So thinking that, that there is that constituency that will react to that.
I don't have anything there.
Alireza, you have done.
So I've heard several theories as to why he's become so prominent. One is that he is actually the front runner to succeed Khamenei, and the presidential election was a trial run for him to see how people reacted to him. And I think the reaction was very bad because he's in Iran known as an executioner among a large part of the population. In fact, he's an Hojjatul Islam, which is a mid-ranking cleric, but a lot of people call him Hojjatul Edam, Edam meaning execution. So his reputation is pretty bad. So this could have been a trial run, but I also think that the Conservatives needed somebody to run, and he could have been their candidate, and they may have not done any better knowing that they can't really win elections since Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, that people won't go and vote for conservatives anymore. And there's another theory that some of the conservatives opposed to his leadership encouraged him to run so he would be defeated and not be able to become the supreme leader. So that's a possibility. I don't know how true that is. But ultimately, I don't think it really matters if Raisi becomes supreme leader. I think the type of person is more important. That if Raisi doesn't become the leader, there's so many other people they can choose from, especially who don't have a terrible reputation as being executioners. I think if he became leader, he would not be acceptable to the vast majority of Iranians, and that would be a real problem for him, because Iran is not like it was in 1989 when Khamenei became the leader. The population is much better educated, much better experienced with politics, and they're going to realize that if they let somebody like Raisi become the leader again, that Iran will not change whatsoever, because since Khamenei became the leader, the country has declined in so many ways.
Yes, please.
Ramya Ramji with the University of Southern California. Thank you all for a wonderful panel. My question was regarding the 7 areas of focus that you mentioned, Ellie. So Chinese investment hasn't increased in the region since the nuclear deal came into effect. So I was wondering, in an effort to increase economic trade with Asia and the Asian region, why is the Chabahar port open mostly to Indian and Japanese investment and not an integral part of the One Belt, One Road initiative? Thank you.
Well, the Chabahar port is something that the Rouhani government has actually invested a lot of time, both in terms of PR and thinking about the kind of long-term investment projection. And it plays a part in the both Central Asian geopolitics and the Pakistan-India geopolitics, particularly with the access to Afghanistan. And there's a faction inside Iran, and I don't think Rouhani discredits this, that do think that Chinese investment in Central Asia is going to be one of the biggest potential fueling ports for Iran on various issues. So I think they are looking at China for certain sectors, and they're looking at the Europeans for others. But the relationship with China is one that is, I think there is at least consensus from the Supreme Leader's Office as well as the IRGC that this is something that they find very acceptable, and they want to try and deepen those economic ties. Now, again, that doesn't mean it's going to be for every sector, but they're going to pick and choose. And Iran investing in the One Belt, One Road initiative is also going to be, I think, part of Rouhani's agenda going forward.
Ali, can I add to that? Or
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's such an important project. But remember, this port, and this is Iran's only deep sea port, was offered to the United States by the Shah of Iran to Henry Kissinger as a place that could be hosting American military vessels coming to the region, way before Abu Dhabi or Jebel Ali in UAE became the key port for the US military. In other words, they're thinking about making Chabahar into a huge, port that becomes conduit. Back then, it was the Soviet Union wouldn't allow it to happen, but since the Soviet Union, that port could become a transit, the key transit route to the landlocked Central Asian states. My point is, this has been thought about for so long, and the question is, why don't they push ahead? Why is it that decades on, port of Chabahar is still basically not utilized? And I think that takes us to something that Ellie mentioned. Ellie mentioned, if I understood you correctly, that one of the things that Rouhani government wants to do is project economic power. And Iran has everything that you want in that part of the world to be able to project power. But what is lacking in Tehran is that priority number one. Because I bet you the IRGC generals probably have a different idea about what projection of power ought to be. They're not focused on economics. You mentioned Chabahar port. I mean, there are other strategic projects that are not going anywhere. The Iran gas pipeline to Pakistan, 22 years they've been thinking about it. So the Iranians need to think about how do we become powerful? Is it security? Is it having proxies and militiamen running around in Syria? Or do we become a South Korea or a Germany after Second World War? That debate is ongoing. I'm not sure who's going to win it, but that's what's happening right now in Tehran.
And just maybe one sentence.
Okay.
One should not forget the competition between Chabahar and Gwadar that the Chinese are obviously supporting.
Yes.
Julia Saad from Open Society Foundations. I'm here on behalf of Farnoosh, who's listening from New York. My question is on human rights, and do you see a possibility for opening in the human rights field, whether tied to the lifting of non-nuclear sanctions or European diplomacy and investment?
Me, okay. So I can tell you how the Europeans are trying to tackle this issue. It is part of their discussions, but they are also treating it with a lot of delicacy in terms of how prominent they make the issue on the front pages when they're discussing this. And there is a sense that a lot of the advancements on human rights can take place under the radar. For example, there has been a lot of discussions on the death penalty between European civil societies, governments, and Iran, and that has led to certain improvements. For example, there's a bill that has been seriously under consideration by Parliament and has been progressing through the various chambers on the use of death penalty, particularly for drug offences, and that has been one of the key issues that Europeans have been working on. But there's a recognition that there's a lot of work to do. But there is also, I think, at least from the European Union, a recognition that this needs to be a two-way conversation for it to be constructive.
Anybody else commenting? Well, many years ago under Khatami, it was the pressure of the European Union that stopped the stoning of women, and that was very important. So maybe the death penalty will be the same thing, but we just have to see. Yes, please.
Hi, Colin Winston, APAC. This is a question for any or all of the panelists. In 2001, President Khatami was reelected with, I think, 77% of the vote. Rouhani got 57%. In 2001, Khatami had solid control over the Majlis. The same can't be said of Rouhani. And we all know that over the next 4 years, there was a struggle between Khatami and the supreme leader and the deep state, and we all know who won in that struggle. Why is Rouhani going to do any better than Khatami did?
Maybe I
Who
can try
takes?
it.
Yeah, right, please, I'm sorry.
Because Rouhani is much more of a cunning politician than Khatami ever was. It's as simple as that. And obviously the Iranian society has also changed, and the system has also changed and evolved. But Rouhani has seen the experience of the past 3 presidents, and I think he will be better able to manage and navigate these very difficult waters of Iranian politics. There are, and remember that he's a man who, as National Security Advisor for almost 2 decades, has the experience of building consensus within the system. And as I said, consensus is key. Whereas Khatami had no direct experience of doing anything like that. He was the Minister of Culture before he became president. He never had a direct relationship with the Supreme Leader. As National Security Advisor, Rouhani used to meet Supreme Leader on a daily basis. So they had a relationship. So I think overall his chances are much better, but this is not to say he doesn't face very serious obstacles. But there are ways in which, at least based on his first-term record, we can guess how he's going to handle some issues. For example, on human rights. On human rights, Rouhani's argument is likely to be about security of the system. He's going to say, look, now that the nuclear issue is resolved, the West is looking for new pretexts to put pressure on us. Look at Secretary Tillerson standing next to Saudi Foreign Minister criticizing Iran for human rights. So we have to make sure that we don't provide that pretext. I'm not arguing about changing the nature of our system, but let's let in this Special Rapporteur for Human Rights, UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights. She's much less controversial than her predecessor. Khatami did this in his second term. We can make some progress with the Europeans. So he can use security arguments that, again, as I said, because the system at this stage needs stability, would probably welcome or work with him. But if we're talking about a full-out confrontation in the same way that Khatami did, fighting many fires at the same time, he's definitely going to burn as a result of it.
Can I add to that quickly, Hana?
Yeah, please.
I mean, I think it's a very legitimate question and concern to have. We don't know if Rouhani is going to do anything different. I mean, in fact, you can turn around and say, what's the one success story of his first term is the nuclear deal. But we all know the nuclear deal negotiations began before he was president. Khamenei wanted a deal. It wasn't Rouhani's doing. Rouhani was, the public face of that. As I said in my remarks, here is the challenge for Rouhani. Is he going to push back? Is he going to continue the kind of language he adopted during the campaign in the last few days or weeks? Because if he does, as I said, people will be behind him. But I agree again with Ali. He is very cautious. He is supremely cautious. And that might just make it that he's unable. His hands are simply tied. I mean, in his first press conference, right after he was reelected, the one issue that got people cheering for him, the names of Mir Hossein Mousavi and Mehdi Karabi, the two political opposition figures under house arrest, in the first press conference, on that question, what are you going to do? He dodged it. He went back to I am the president. I uphold the Constitution. That's not going to cut it. I mean, you're not going to be a reformist with that kind of attitude. And you cannot be a reformist only when Khamenei allows you to be a reformist. A real, genuine reform in Iran will come when you have a serious president who is willing to say to Khamenei, for the sake of this regime that you and I both brought about in 1979, we need to make some serious changes, and that remains to be seen.
I thank you very much. I think we are done with our time. The next panel starts at 11:15. It's going to be a very exciting panel on Iran's foreign policy. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you, Hala.
Merci. خیلی ممنون.
خواهش میکنم. Let me give you my card.
Thank
We haven't
you.
crossed paths
Yeah,
before.
I don't have a
Merci,
card, but